music tonight.
You know, there were some things from the copy editor they would do that would blow your mind, and I'll tell you about those sometime as well.
Got a little more light here on the patio, so hopefully that's better.
Definitely an improvement, Glenn.
Yeah, well, I look best in the shadows.
Always been told I've got a face for radio.
Glenn, you may speak now, Glenn.
I may speak now.
Yes.
As in the program has started?
Yes, it has.
Okay. Well, I thought there was the theme music part, Todd.
Did I not share the theme music?
No, I didn't hear any theme music. But,
Are you serious? Nobody heard theme music.
I did not hear theme music. No.
Oh, okay. We've got a little problem on my end here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm gonna take over then. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on VBC Happy Hour and Greatest Generation Live. I am Todd DiPastino. I'm the Executive Director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and I'm here with two of my bosses, Glenn Flickinger, who's the host of Greatest Generation Live,
Hello.
and Brad Washabaugh, who is his wingman tonight. Brad, how many years did you serve in the Marine Corps?
I served 29 years in the Marine Corps and was an infantry officer from 1976 through 2005.
Was it exactly 29 years or was it like 28 years, 8 months, maybe?
It was rounded off to 29 years. It's somewhere around there. That's good enough, though.
Okay, so they round.
For pension purposes, what did they round it off to, Brad?
Thank you, Glenn.
That's really what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, 29 years.
Okay, they rounded up to 29 years. Okay, yeah, we just had to clarify that. Brad's been giving me grief about misstating the number of years he served in the Marine Corps, which was 29.
Yes.
So I'm going to throw it to Glenn, and then Glenn, you can let everybody know what we're talking about tonight, and then throw it back to me, and I'll talk about two sponsors, and we'll get on with it.
That's a lot of throwing. We're in spring training, so we're pitching it back and forth here. No, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Veterans Breakfast Club Happy Hour, what we call Greatest Generation Live. So Greatest Generation Live is everything World War II. We interview World War II veterans. We've had the pleasure of interviewing a couple dozen, I would guess, over the last few years, and lots of different authors of World War II books. And tonight we have Mr. Stephen McCloud. Stephen, wave your hand, say hello, please. There he is.
Good evening, everyone.
From Chattanooga, Tennessee, do I have that right?
Do indeed.
There we go. There's hardly any accent there, Steve. And his book is a book called Black Dragon, the experience of a Marine rifle company in the Central Pacific, obviously in World War II. And we'll get into the details of how Steve came to write that book and what makes it so different than any other account like this that I've ever read, and I think that exists out there. And it has a lot to do with how Steve researched this, how he developed the content, et cetera, et cetera. And then, as we were kidding earlier, there's also Brad Washabaugh on with us tonight. Brad's read the book as well. Brad's been my advisor on this a bit over the past couple of months because of Brad's Marine Corps experience and having been the captain of a rifle company. So he'll give us some great insights into this as we develop the discussion. So I think that's about my turn to pitch it back to you. Is that about right?
That's about right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this program, our Monday night online programs are brought to us by two special sponsors. One is D&D Auto Salvage. They're a state-of-the-art metal recycling and auto salvage facility, a family-owned business, 2 locations here in Western Pennsylvania. We have something that we will be announcing. We're very excited to announce. We have a car cruise that's really being sponsored and pushed by D&D Auto Salvage this summer. We're scheduling a car cruise. So I will be asking you if you have any classic cars or anything like that to join us at our car cruise in August. But I do want to let you know now that they are a family-owned business with over 3 decades of metal recycling experience for industry and the individual scrapper. The company has a fleet of trucks and heavy equipment that can remove and process scrap of any kind of variety in any kind of location. D&D is proud to be a dedicated and longtime supporter of veterans and of the Veterans Breakfast Club specifically, and we're very grateful for their support. You could learn more at dndautosalvage.com. We are also sponsored by Tobacco-Free Adagio Health, and Adagio Health supports family and children, especially women and children, healthcare, and they have a special program called Tobacco-Free that is dedicated to reducing tobacco use by educating the public about the hazards of tobacco use and vaping, and by advocating for policies for safer places to live, work, and play. They also help people to quit smoking and use tobacco, and you could learn more by calling you could go learn more by going to tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. But if you're looking to quit tobacco use and you could use some counseling, you could call 1-800-QUIT-NOW. That's 1-800-QUIT-NOW. So thank you so much, Tobacco Free and D&D Auto Salvage. As always, we are keeping everybody muted. But if you do have a comment or a question, please do feel free to put it in the chat. You could also raise your hand like this and wave it, and I will see you. And you could also raise your hand electronically. So do that on Zoom if you can, and we'll make sure to get your questions in. All right, back to you, Glenn.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Todd. And I will pause once or twice during the program to ask for questions as well. The more interactive we can make these programs, we feel the better off, the better the program comes off. So let's get started. Now, I need my traditional 30 seconds of fumbling with the PowerPoint slides. Todd, am I enabled to share? Todd, can you hear me? Because all of a sudden I cannot hear you.
Do you know why you couldn't hear me? Because I was muted. I was going to say I have the same PowerPoint also, Glenn, if you'd prefer, but you do have the ability to share your PowerPoint.
Yeah, okay, good. No, we've been making changes on the fly.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so let me play with this here and get this going. Okay, couple more clicks. Wait a second. Okay,
Yeah,
there we
good.
go. Except I'm totally on the wrong page. So let me get to the start of this. It's a little different for me because I normally do this on from my office desk at home, and all I have right now is my laptop. Okay, so I'm trying to do it from our timeshare in Orlando, Florida, on a laptop. So now let me try that again. Okay. Now, can everybody see that? We're good? Okay. Okay, so tonight, a historical discussion with Stephen D. McCloud, author of Black Dragon, Experience of a Marine Corps Rifle Company in the Central Pacific. Here's a great picture of Stephen. Stephen, we see you there, at least I see you there on the insert. Stephen is a business consultant, historian, and now he's become an author. And what has made this book, I think, different than any other book about World War II is the methodology and the research that Stephen used in developing the book over a 25-year time frame, Stephen, is that right?
No, 25 years with the Marines of this rifle company. That's right.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more about you, Stephen. What's your background? How did you get involved in getting to know this rifle company?
Well, thanks again for having me here this evening. First of all, let me not forget to say so. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I started studying Far Eastern history somewhere around 1990. And it was 1996 when I finally reached out to this rifle company of Marines. I'd also visited with some paratroopers of the 511th and so forth, who had jumped into the Philippines and various groups of that nature. But wanted to find some Marines and found these guys in the back of the magazine, VFW, American Legion, so forth. They would advertise their reunions and list phone numbers of contacts. So I just picked up the phone, picked one out, picked up the phone, called Irby Hip in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And we talked for about an hour, and he said, "You need to come to the reunion." And I said, "Well, I was hoping you'd say that." And that was in Charleston, South Carolina in 1996. So I walked in the room there, and that's how we got started.
How many participants at that first Fox Company reunion?
I would have to estimate probably 35 or 40, somewhere in there, including spouses.
Yeah.
And some of the guys came, it lasted a week. Some came for part of the week and left, and some came later on, and so forth.
And how did it develop from there? You just kept going to these reunions and getting to know these men.
I did.
Their stories.
That's right. And they actually voted me an honorary member of the company. So I was officially welcome to do so. Over the years, traveled also with them. Now, I'd visit the guys at home when I was on the road. Danny Thomas out in Texas, or any of the other fellows around Ohio or other places, and also traveled overseas and went to the Pacific with a couple of them on several occasions. So that was very helpful as well. Now, since you've put this screen up here, Glenn, let's set the historical stage about who we're talking about.
Right.
Now, before World War II, folks would be perhaps surprised, who've not served in the Marine Corps, might be surprised to know that the Marine Corps could not have fielded a division before World War II. They were organized mostly by regiments and had grouped together in brigades and so forth. It was a very small organization, the Marine Corps was, until December 7th, 1941. And it simply exploded. In fact, they had to throttle the new enlistments to give themselves time to buy property and build places like Camp Pendleton and so forth and expand so they could actually train these folks. So eventually, by the end of the war, the Marine Corps put 162 rifle companies in the Pacific. That's 27 in a division, and they had 6 Marine divisions. So a rifle company, we're talking about, let's call it 230 to 240 men. It varied throughout the war and varied by company as well, but that's roughly 230. And these are the fellows with the rifles and the fighting knives. And it's their job, to put it bluntly, to go hunting for the enemy. And the rest of the Marine Corps, I would submit, is there to support those fellows. Right. So this is the pointy end of the stick, and this rifle company is one of the 27 companies in the 4th Marine Division during World War II. And we talk about the regiments whereby the Marine Corps was and still really is kind of known. If you're in the Marines, you're in one of the regiments, you're in 3rd Marines, 23rd, wherever it might be. And it's referred to that way. So the 4th Marines is a regiment and not the division. I'm just point that out. So there are 3 infantry regiments in a division. For the 4th Marine Division, it was the 23rd, 24th, and 25th Marines. And they've got 3 battalions, infantry battalions each, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And so every 2nd battalion has a Fox company in every regiment. Right. That's always going to be in 2nd battalion. So don't let that confuse you. If you hear someone say Fox Company in the 4th Marine Division, well, that doesn't tell you much. Right. Now, Fox Company in 23rd Marines, that tells us exactly who we're talking about. And there's this curiosity of 2 F-23. And Marines these days will say, well, that's wrong. And if you've got that in your advertising, you must not know what you're talking about. Well, actually, that's the way it was written in World War II and beforehand. Nobody seems to know why, but that's what was adopted early on. Later units may have changed that. They were trying to, the Marine Corps was trying to change things, but once things embed themselves in the unit, they stay there. So 2F23 became really a proper name to these guys.
Right, right.
And they stuck with it.
I want to go back just a couple of slides to the title here, Black Dragon. How did you come up with the name Black Dragon, and what does it mean?
Well, unfortunately, I've forgotten how I came up with it. But the title was used for a PME that I do for the Marine Corps. PME meaning Professional Military Education. That's a shorthand for lectures or battlefield staff rides, what have you. But it's a multimedia or blended media presentation that I was doing for the Marine Corps called Black Dragon, the experience of a rifle company on Iwo Jima. And it's got many meanings. One is, as the Marines have referred to it, of that era. One example, for example, when Gunny Douglas's wife passed away, and he was telling me about that, and he said to me, I learned a long time ago that there are things that happen in life that change our lives forever, and I've always referred to them as black dragons. Well, that had come up many times over the decades, and I had not necessarily realized it. But also, many of the correspondents who were out there trying to do the best job they could for the American people back home, trying to describe the look of this island out there in the middle of the Pacific. Some of them referred to it as, well, it looked like some kind of monster lurking up out of the sea. So it's also intended to give a new moniker to the island of Iwo Jima.
Right. And you've been there, as I recall, right? You've visited Iwo Jima yourself.
I have. I've been there on a couple of occasions. First time as a visitor with one of our Navy corpsmen, and the next time as a tour guide.
And Brad, you visited Iwo Jima once as a Marine.
Yes, it was back in 1982. We did a heliborne assault on Iwo Jima to secure a site to practice non-combatant evacuation. And I tell you, Iwo Jima is a place you never forget. It's Suribachi dominates the entire island, and you have this feeling of a ground that's hallowed. That the casualties on that island, no matter where you step, if you go back in time, you can almost visualize the intense battlefield and in sacrifice on both sides of death and destruction. It is a place that when you step on it, you'll never forget the volcanic sand, which is more like gravel, and you'll never forget Suribachi, which dominates the whole island. I can see how the name Black Dragon came about.
Yeah.
Now, if I may, Glenn, here's an opportunity with Brad having visited there.
Please.
Because when I first visited this place, in fact, I was walking around with Marines of the 31st MEU from Okinawa, and we're pounding ground way up on the northwest side of the island, 5th Marine Division zone. But I kept turning around to see if that thing could still see me.
Yes.
And it always could.
Yes.
That's the sense that I had. And secondly, I would tell you that there's two quick stories here. This is all answer to your question, Glenn. The first trip to Iwo Jima for me was 2001, and we had been on Guam, we'd been on Saipan, been on Tinian with veterans and a very large group, and had a smash up time. Been a great time. The morning we got up to fly to Iwo Jima, and we were standing in the hotel lobby of the Outrigger on Guam, and there were about 250 people, maybe 300 all told. And you had Stephen Ambrose was there, and you had film crews from Steven Spielberg that he was sending out. And I've often told it this way: as I stood there in the lobby, this is what it sounded like. And I realized this was different. We'd been on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, had a great time, these same folks. And this morning, something was different about this. Most of these folks were civilians, but everybody knew it. And the flights there, we were on 2 aircraft, they were also quiet. And the pilots of the Continental Airlines jets who were flying us spent half hour, our plane did, half hour just slowly circling around this thing and given an opportunity for folks on both sides of the plane to look down on this thing. And that's what you're visiting. There's no sense whatsoever that you're visiting an island. There's something lurking out there in the Pacific Ocean. When I got back, a Marine asked me to write something for his website. This is 2001. And without any intent here, just naturally, I said, I don't know how to describe it any other way, except for some reason, it's like going back in time to see the dragon. I said, I don't know what that means. That's the only way I know how to describe it. There's something out there.
Wow. It's obviously very powerful. Haunting, I suppose, is the right word, Brad. Place.
Yes.
Well, look, let's move forward back to the history of this. So we know the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions were just that, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions to be formed in early 42. The 1st Marines famously at Guadalcanal, 2nd Marines follow them, I think, later at Guadalcanal. And then the Marines, as you said, keep adding men, adding divisions, forming these divisions from scratch, right? So when did the 4th Marine Division get started? And specifically, when did Fox Company begin to come together?
Well, 4th Marine Division really began with the 23rd Marines. That was formed out of a few units, mostly the 6th Marines in North Carolina in 1942, July 1942. Mm-hmm. And that's when Fox Company was then formed also in North Carolina. At that time, it was still called Camp New River. It had not yet been renamed to Camp Lejeune. So they are the oldest and were the oldest regiment of the 4th Marine Division. There was the 24th Marines. Well, let me back up. The 23rd was eventually split in half to form the nucleus of another regiment for the division, which became the 25th Marines. And you'll recall in the book, the description of the guys, it was like picking sides for a game, and they just split the rifle company in half, for example, Fox Company, and sent half of them over to form the 25th Marines. And there was a 3rd regiment in California, the 24th Marines. So they finally moved these two across the United States to join with the 24th Marines at Camp Pendleton. And that's when the 4th Marine Division was stood up, you might say.
Okay.
Was activated.
And this is a map out of Steve's book, which just has, I suppose we could spend an hour just on this map, but we'll have to spend maybe 30 seconds on it. But it does just a fantastic job of illustrating the path of the 23rd Marines, 2nd Battalion, Fox Company from the United States to Hawaii, where it's staged in late 43, to have that about right. 43, right? And its first campaign was then in January of 44. You can see the, let me see if I can get my cursor going here. You can see this lower arrow pointing towards the Marshall Islands. We're going to talk about this just a little bit. So there's several campaigns here. The Marshall Islands, which is an island we're going to talk about called Roy Namor. After that, back to Hawaii to rest and recuperate and train and replacements, and then back in mid 1944 to Guam, or I'm sorry, Saipan and Tinian, and then back to Hawaii, rest and train again, and then, well, I'm sorry, here's Saipan and Tinian, and then finally to Iwo Jima, right? So there's 4 island battles: Roy Namor, which is part of the Marshall Islands, Tinian and Saipan, and then Iwo Jima. Right? Have all that correct, Steve?
That's right. And that map is intended, one of the intents for it, is to show that the 4th Marine Division left the West Coast and went straight to their first operation in the Marshalls. They did pause overnight at Maui to get their orders. Most of the folks stayed aboard ship, however, and then went back to Maui and did this thing over and over again. And they would stage in the operations after that, they'd stage at Eniwetok to regroup the troop transports and everything else there and refuel, and then go on to the next location. So every time you see an arrow pointing left, you consider that there's also now going to be an arrow pointing back to the right to undo the trip they just made. So these guys sailed. They were at sea during their period of time in World War II. They were at sea for 6 months and sailed over 27,000 miles, more than the circumference of the Earth.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about some of the men. And one of the things that we have to do here is focus in on half a dozen of the men or so that Steve got to know so very well. Some of them he got to know personally. Some of them had already passed, but in his book, there must be, I didn't count them, Steve, but 60, 70 men that he talks about at one time or another, and they all deserve individual attention. But in an hour and a half, we're only going to get to half a dozen of them. Okay. And I thought we'd start with what I thought were some of the most interesting men, who were the captains who served, the men who served as the captains, the commander of the infantry division. And the first one was this man, Jack Hadley, right here on the left. Correct, Steve?
That's correct, Glenn. That's right.
And he was the captain from July of 1942.
Well, close. He came at the turn of the year. Before that time, there was a revolving door as they're trying to get this organization formed up. So you've got a few officers passing through. Some never. They were always at regiment. They're just paper commands. But finally, Jack showed up, and he was really their first company commander. He'd been down in the Panama Zone before that time. He's from Dayton, Ohio, and he had been a little All-American, as they called it, a halfback at Dayton University, the Dayton Flyers. And gold number 99. They had numerous nicknames for him, but he did. He was selected for the national All-Star game to play against the Green Bay Packers. And now he'd hurt his knee, unfortunately, during that time, so he sat that game out. But he was drafted by the Detroit Lions in 1940, and he opted out of that and went instead and got a job as an accountant once he finished his degree. And when wartime approached, he joined the Marine Corps.
And went into what, officer training with the Marine Corps because of his college education?
He did. That's correct.
Right.
And now I would point something out, and even the photograph that you had before, Glenn, if you want to pop back there, this is taken on Saipan once the island is not only declared secure, but after the 2nd Battalion, 23rd, has completed the mop-up with another couple of units, the 2nd Marines and so forth. And they've had enough by this time. I can just tell you, they're exhausted. But these two fellows to the right of Jack Padley knew him from Dayton. In fact, Lou Rock there, who was the, assistant operations officer, if I recall correctly, for the division.
The older man in the middle. Yeah.
In the center. That's right. And then the combat correspondent to the right, whose name escapes me again at the moment here, had been with the 2nd Marine Division throughout the operation. And once things settled down, he came looking for Padley and for Lou Rock there, and said, let's get them together. And went and got Padley. He had just shaven, gotten rid of his beard, and put on a clean shirt. They were nasty after that full operation. So they got together, and there was a long newspaper story written, and I use that extensively in the book because we get a chance to hear from Jack and the first sergeant and so forth. But once again, you're lucky if you could catch Jack with a camera. And from his time back in college, they say you did well to get a yes sir or no sir, something like that out of him in interviews. He didn't have much use for attention. And
right.
And I would tell you that that bled down through the company as well.
And here he is with his executive commander, whose nickname I just loved, and that was Grandma Hayes, Bill Grandma Hayes. And at first I thought, well, he must have been an older guy, but not so. He's a younger man. Why did they call him Grandma, Steve?
Well, unfortunately, nobody remembers. They never did remember why he got his nickname. Some they remembered, but that one, they always just presumed it's because he was sort of the mother hen. He was looking after everybody, which I go with, because that's kind of what he did after the war as well. He wanted to work in what we maybe call human resources and that kind of thing these days. But that was his thing. He was much beloved by all the fellows. A very good executive officer. Jack's holding a Davis Cup racket there, by the way.
Yeah.
Every athlete had a dartboard in his tent on Maui and always would challenge you to a game.
And then we have some of the other commanders. Remind me now who is in this shot, Steve.
Okay. Well, so Jack Padley led the company through the first three operations. And after the Marianas, 4th Marine Division was in great disarray. And they didn't know where, for that matter, where their casualties had gone. There was no record of that when they were evacuated. So they didn't know who they were getting back or who they weren't. So there was a massive shift. And of course, promotions played into this as well. So Jack Padley got promoted to major and moved up to the battalion as the executive officer. And in the center, then Captain Lawrence F. Snowden, who had been leading K Company, 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines. He was brought over to replace Jack as the commander of Fox Company. And on our left, as we look at Larry, is Charlie Ahern. Charles Ahern had been with the company from the early days in North Carolina as one of the platoon leaders when he wasn't having to work with Lieutenant Colonel Dillon. We can talk about that sometime if you want. But now he's going to be the company exec for Larry Snowden. Now, right. It's interesting as you read the book, there's a pretty good dichotomy right there, or contrast, because Charlie was a reserve Marine and a reserve officer through and through. He wasn't going to make a career and had no interest in formalities, really. And Larry maybe was quite the opposite. And on the right is Lieutenant Frank Collins, who one of the platoon leaders and was leading 1st Platoon now. And at the time that Larry showed up on Maui and took over the company at the end of October 1944, and that's about a month before they board ships and head to Iwo Jima or embark for Iwo Jima, that's all he's got as far as officers in Fox Company, because the battalion is at roughly 50% strength still at that time.
Wow. Wow. And so it's Larry Snowden who leads them on Iwo Jima, with Ahern takes his place when he's wounded on Iwo Jima.
That's right, twice.
Short period of time, a couple of weeks, as I recall.
That's right. Larry was wounded and evacuated twice, once to Guam, and he'd picked up a bunch of shrapnel from one of the rockets and also was deafened and had blast concussion and so forth. But told me that by the time he got to Guam, his hearing started to return, and he and one of the other officers of the battalion went down and got permission to hop a mail plane back to Iwo Jima, not to get back into the fight, but to get back with their buddies, their men, their home.
Right.
And he's wounded a little later on as well in the northern part of the island. And that's Charlie Ahern.
Yeah.
Still wearing the single bar of the 1st lieutenant. He was promoted to captain on Iwo Jima.
And just to go back to Snowden, he stays in the Marines and has a long, very storied career in the Marine Corps.
Well, I was waiting for Brad to say 28 and a half years or something like that. Those half years matter, but Larry would always say he was in the Marine Corps for 37 and a half years and retired. He did, in fact, overnight. Between Saipan and Tinian, when they had finished with Saipan and were launching for Tinian, they spent a night on the LST out in the middle of the ocean, waiting to land the next morning. And overnight, he changed his commission to a full regular Marine Corps. So he was going to make a career of it from right then. And he went on to retire as Lieutenant General and Chief of Staff of the Marine Corps, Assistant Commandant, when he retired in 1979.
Was he still in the Marines, Brad, when you joined the Marines?
Unmute here. Yes, when I read the book, I recall seeing his name signed on these documents that, as you're an officer, you need to read all these orders and whatnot. I remember the name Snowden, and I made the connection once I read the book. So,
yeah.
Well, now Brad went to the 3rd Marines, or commanded a company in the 3rd Marines.
Yes.
When they did this training evolution on Iwo Jima. Well, when Larry left Maui in 1945 after Iwo Jima, he was sent to the 3rd Marines. they were getting ready for the invasion of Japan. Now, the 3rd Marines, as you'll recall, never landed on Iwo Jima during World War II, and they weren't pleased about that.
Yeah. Held in reserve the whole time, right?
That's right.
Which was I can't remember the name of the Marine general commanding at that time, Schmidt, I think it was, criticized quite a bit for not bringing another. Anyway, let's not go there yet. Okay. So I was quite taken in the book by this man, Bob Cook, and fascinating picture of him, obviously posed. And that's, he's a war correspondent. And what I loved about it, he's got his carbine there, and then he's got his typewriter right there. I'm like, which one would you rather shoot? He's an interesting figure in the book. Took a lot of the photographs that are in the book. Tell us about Bob Cook and what role he played in this.
Well, Bob he was a name that I heard early on at reunions. Some of the guys would have photographs. They said, a fellow named Bob Cook gave me this picture. And so I knew that name from way back. And when I started going to the National Archives and going through the still photos there, the Marine Corps still photos, and I was looking for things that were relevant and looking for terrain specifically and things of that nature. And good shots. And I'd look over there to see who the photographer was, and son of a gun, guess who it was many times. So I realized I'm going to start looking for Bob's photographs because he's with them a lot. Later on, as I did the homework, learned that he was a public relations officer for the regiment, for 23rd Marines, and spent really all his time with the 2nd Battalion through the war. So he followed these folks through all 4 operations, through most of those operations, and got to know many of them, wrote a great many stories, and took hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs. So I determined early on I was going to use him as a central thread and use his photographs as much as possible, and his articles.
Yeah. And you use quite a few of his articles, excerpts from them in the book, and they really, in my mind, enrich the book. Because he's talking about individual Marines many times in these articles. And I think it's just a beautiful use of somebody writing, at that time. He was there, he saw it all, he knew these men. Yeah. That's
exactly. There's nothing like contemporaneous, period accounts. And he was on the scene. Now, as you and I discussed previously, Bob was, he's public relations. So I view him as cheerleader in chief for the battalion. He's writing for the folks at home. Yeah. And when he would write these dispatches, he would scribble on there what newspapers need to be contacted back in, Pittsburgh or wherever it might be that he's, whoever he's writing about, so that their families see it. And we had articles published here in Chattanooga on some of the Fox Company boys who lived here. And he took photos of them, wrote stories, and sent them here as well. And they appeared in the newspapers. So you had to watch what you used from him a little bit.
Yeah.
But the other fact life is there are facts in there as well. He does document events, and you can tell when he's telling it just like it is, and you can weed out the fluff. Now listen, show and tell. I don't want to take too much time, but what he's doing, he carried his typewriter. That's an Hermes Baby typewriter, which was issued to all the correspondents in the Marine Corps. And he carried it in his backpack, Marine Corps backpack, lower pack. And he's just got it peeking out, typewriters go, very handy, and with a very quick, very light action.
Wow.
So here's what he's got. This one, I was pleased. This one's dated actually 1941. But that's what Cook used there with his carbine. And of course, his camera was a speed graphic, anniversary model speed graphic.
Was there a combat correspondent like this assigned to each regiment, each battalion?
I don't know about, I'm not sure I can answer that specifically. They were spread out all over the place, and some were photographers, some are writers, some are mixed. He's an interesting fellow because of his role in the regiment as a public relations guy, as opposed to
Yeah.
David Dempsey or some of these others who are really combat correspondents. And he's a correspondent, but it's a slightly different role.
Right. I'm sure the Army guys would say, yeah, the Marines did a really good job with their public relations, right? They got all the press.
You bet. That's exactly right.
So we're going to jump now into the early campaigns, and we can't go into any depth on the first three. Okay, we're going to touch bases, make a couple of points on each one. But before we make that jump, I don't know, Todd, are there any questions we should address before we move to the next phase of this?
I think you should move to the next phase, and we do have some questions here, but we'll round them up in the next 20 minutes or so.
Okay. Let me get back to sharing screen. Okay, what am I doing wrong here?
Well, that looks pretty good.
Yeah, it does. It's Hawaii. There we are. Okay. So their first campaign is in Operation Flintlock, which was the attack on the Marshall Islands in early 1944. And the 23rd and 24th Marines are assigned to attack an island called Roy Namor, which I'm guessing not a whole lot of people would be able to give us that fact. Not one of the better known island battles of the war. But Steve, give us a little background here. Why Roy Namor, which is part of the, how do you pronounce this? Kwajalein Atoll?
Kwajalein, that's
Kwajalein?
right.
Okay.
Largest atoll in the world. So this was no improvisation, this operation. So as you may recall, War Plan Orange had been developed over many, many years. Where initially, back in the 20s, we thought if we get in trouble with Japan, we're going to have to race out and save the Philippines. And then the more we war gamed that, the more we realized it was going to take a long time to get over that far. You're not just going to dash through all the islands that had been mandated to Japan by the League of Nations after World War I. And island groups like this were standing in the way, and they were going to be prohibited. So this had all been planned out. And when the Central Pacific campaign started, finally, in November of 1943, and that's late November, actually, that's the first operation at the Gilbert Islands when the 2nd Marine Division lands at Tarawa. These guys, 4th Marine Division, they're back in California, and they're supposed to be ready for action in December, just a couple of weeks later. And the disaster, really, in the landing at Tarawa scared the wits out of everybody. And the 4th Marine Division's been practicing, rehearsing, climbing down nets and climbing into Higgins boats, flat-bottom Higgins boats, like you see at D-Day in Normandy, with a front ramp coming down. The problem was found at Tarawa, those couldn't get past the coral reef. And we knew very well that just about every battle these guys are going to have to fight in the Central Pacific. The islands would be surrounded by coral reefs. Mm-hmm. So there was a mad dash in 30 days to stand up brand new LVT or Amtrak battalions that did not exist with troops who did not exist, some of them tankers and others not tankers at all. And then to try to train this way and then figure out a new plan to get those out there for the next operation after the Gilbert Islands, and that was in the Marshalls. Now that was an entire improvisation. Now, the Marshalls was known that that's where we're going to have to go, but the switch over to this Amtrak was almost done in a panic pace within 1 month.
But so, Steve, there were Amtraks at Tarawa, just not enough of them.
Not nearly enough. That's right.
And not organized well. So the switchover was getting more of them, manufacturing more of them, and getting them into theater. And then I take it, as I understand it, organizing the actual crews into LTV battalions. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. So the 4th Marine Division had one Amtrak battalion, which I guess was the 4th Amtrak battalion at that time, and they needed to form the 10th Amphibious Battalion and also part of the 11th, and need to get that done in short term. Well, these guys had to figure out how you operate these things, had to figure out how you maintain them. They had to modify them for combat. They had to learn how to drive them, and then they had to learn how to drive as a unit, and then they had to learn how to operate and land Marines in a force, and they had to build their own places to live.
Hey, Glenn,
Yes, Brad.
On amphibious operations, they are so complex, and this is just a snapshot of one facet. But, you know, you go through the various stages. First, you have to load the ships, and you have to reverse load them, anticipating how you're going to offload them. And then you have to set up a plan for debarkation, getting the troops and the equipment together. Then you have to have a plan to get them ashore. Then you have to have a plan for fire support. And all this is an orchestration that, as Stephen said, a lot of it is improvisation, but a lot of it is good training and the ability to recognize that you need to rehearse, you need to train, and you need to be ready to adapt to the conditions. All this is why the nation has the Marine Corps to conduct amphibious operations like this. It isn't done very well on the fly without the doctrine, or without the training, or without the leadership.
And that's just a perfect segue into this point that I wanted to get to with Steve. How does the amphibious operation go at Roy Namur, and how does the battle itself go?
Well, let's talk about the amphibious part very quickly. And if you would, Glenn, switch back to the LST shot there, LST 42. The solution for getting Amtraks out to the Marshall Islands, whoever was in charge of getting this, we've got to get them out there. Typically, the bow opens on these LSTs there, and a ramp comes down, and they were designed by the British to land tanks on beaches, fairly flat beaches. But we could also load those things with these Amtraks, and that would hold 17 of these Amtraks in the well deck there. Well, someone also had the idea, let's use a crane and put 9 more on the top deck. And then they'll lower down the elevator or down the ramp, if the ship had that, on the scene. Well, nobody bothered to figure out whether or not they would even fit through the opening of that ramp, or if their weight outclassed the elevator, which they did. So to answer your question, by the time we get out there, let me also say the troops were sent out there, not on the LSTs with the Amtraks. And that's a long trip. They were sent out there on troop transports. These guys were on the USS Sheridan. And when they got to the scene off the island, outside the atoll there, or outside the lagoon, they went down into Higgins boats and transferred to the LST to spend the night and load up on the Amtraks and launch and land the next morning. But on that morning, it took them, these guys, and that, by the way, is the LST that half of Fox Company was on that night. The other half of the company was on another LST, adding more chaos and friction to the whole evolution. But it took the amphibious force no less than 151 minutes to get the 2 assault rifle companies of the 2nd Battalion in the water on the morning of D-Day.
Yeah. So
that's not good.
No, not good. Fortunately, the battle itself went well. Was it a one-day operation, Steve? Is that correct?
Those are 2 very different islands. They're very small. On the left, you're looking at, I've forgotten, 230 acres, thereabouts, all flat, nothing but an airfield on that thing. You can see clearly from one side to the other. That's on Roy Island on the left. Namur on the other side was heavily vegetated, and that's where all the real structures were and defenses. So yes, the 23rd Marines on the left flew across Roy, but the 24th Marines had a heck of a fight on their hands there for about 3 days. And that was some pretty stiff fighting in that area.
Okay. So I wanted to draw out this discussion about the amphibious operations because the next operation, this was a huge explosion that occurred on Roy, I think it was. You described it in your book, an ammo dump or something that went up. I just thought the picture was dramatic.
And that's a Bob Cook photo.
There we go. Bob.
And he's with Fox Company. Well, he's with the 2nd Battalion, 23rd, actually, on Roy when this thing went up on Namur. And that was one of the structures over there, a big blockhouse that was being assaulted. And nobody knew that it apparently had torpedo warheads inside. So it was a massive explosion when that took place.
So one of the key changes that they fight the Battle of Roy Namur back to Hawaii for training or for rest recuperation, right? And there's a major change made in the structure of the rifle company. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds because we don't have the time to, but I still find it fascinating. And with Brad, a former rifle company captain, get you and Steve to describe what was the change and why did it take place?
Okay, very good. Well, just as these guys were leaving Roy Namur and headed for Maui, which was going to be their rest and training base, there was work already underway. It had been taking place in 1943 back in Camp Pendleton. In fact, a company of the 24th Marines had been trying it out. And what were they trying out? It was called the fire team, 4-man fire team. And prior to that time, the smallest unit in a rifle company was a squad, 12-man squad or 13. And essentially, the shortcut to this is that's too many guys for one guy to lead, okay, in combat in the Pacific. It was tough to make in the chaotic environment, especially on Guadalcanal. It was tough to make the right thing happen the right way at the right time when you're too centrally organized. And this fire team, a 4-man fire team, was an effort to decentralize decision making so that a squad is now, instead of having one decision maker, you got 4. And I often say, listen, we hear a lot of folks these days say, I like my folks to feel empowered and make decisions and that kind of thing. No. Hey, Sergeant, guess what? This is not a choice to you. You now have 4 decision makers in your squad. Your job is to make it work and make it work as one. And that's what they had to work on. And all through 1944, the spring of 44, before they head for Saipan. So that was one of the major elements of the introduction of the fire team here, all built around the BAR, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. And there were others. I think fundamentally what was found, there are too many different teams that have to try to work together. And another big element of that reorganization was to consolidate roles within units, including the rifle company. So right before they go to Saipan, for example, the commandant issues another order that assault demolitions are going to be moved from the engineers and dropped right in the laps of the infantry. So there's hasty training there with flamethrowers and demolition stuff. And they deal with that. But they're trying to consolidate roles and make the rifle team, and certainly at the battalion landing team level, consolidate all that firepower so that you can make, again, the right thing happen the right way at the right time.
So Brad, 35, 40 years later, does this organization chart look familiar to you?
Yeah, during the war, as I read, there was a reorganization of the rifle company every year of the war from 41 to 45. And I think it really capitalized on lessons learned and the need for small unit leadership and the ability to bring organic firepower upon the enemy. So as you look at the organization chart, you see 3 maneuver elements. As a rifle company commander, you would be concerned about maneuvering platoons. And within a platoon, the platoon commander would concentrate on maneuvering squads. And so you have that concept of 3. But when you look at the weapons, the company commander can influence the action by his organic weapons, such as the 60mm mortar and the machine guns. And you'll notice the squads have the ability they have a bazooka, they have a flamethrower, they have demolition. So the idea is to blind, blast, and burn fortifications is a tactic that was used to reduce it. But it's also mutually supporting, that one fire team would support another as you fire a maneuver. You don't want to maneuver all at once with no firepower to suppress the enemy. So it's all about teamwork and coordination and the use of combined arms. And that's the challenge in amphibious operations. You start from ground zero as far as firepower as soon as you hit the shore. And you've got to work forward from that to bring not only organic firepower in, but also supporting arms from ships and from other supporting firepower such as aircraft and artillery. But it's a very dynamic, fluid organization that adapts. And the biggest drawback is casualties. Once you start getting casualties, you have to reorganize. And that's always been a concern, especially with the heavy losses.
And at that time, those fire teams were focused on, if I can get this to move, on the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR. That was, should I call it, the key weapon of a Marine rifle company?
Well, I don't think you'd go wrong by doing it. Every fire team, every four-man fire team was built around the BAR. You had a BAR and two assistant BAR men, really, carrying rifles and more ammunition. And then you had the fire team leader. And that's a lot of firepower. They've got as many as 240 rounds on them in the cartridge belt that they're carrying, plus bandoliers. There's only 20 rounds in that magazine, so you're not just going to hold that trigger back and use it like a machine gun. And the other thing is, in reality, as soon as you open that thing up, the enemy knows where an automatic weapon is, and you are now target number one. Absolutely. But fact life, it was very effective, and the Marines thought very highly of it.
I thought this was an interesting photograph, only it illustrates that it was called the, 1918 BAR.
That's right.
It was actually made for World War I, did not find its way into much combat, if any combat. And so let me jump. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, it won't come up again, but I'll go ahead and mention it while we're looking at that BAR. You would think that it would have a problem because it fired from the open bolt, which means that silver face you see there would be open. And on a place like Iwo Jima, where it was very dusty and rainy and gritty, that could be a problem, and it could be a problem. But what seemed to be more common is simply the spring losing its tension, and it would stop operating right in the middle of combat occasionally. And those who could keep the nerve about them realize they get that spring out and stretch it, and they could make it operate with them again.
So let's jump to the next two island battles. Saipan in June of 1944, which always fascinates me because there's this huge amphibious landing on the other side of the world on June 6th in 1944. And 2 weeks later, there's a huge amphibious landing, arguably almost as big as Normandy in different ways. I mean, Normandy, all it had to do was cross a 20-mile channel. This is truly amphibious warfare where you need a logistical train to, for 1,500 or 2,000 miles.
A long way. And you've got to take everything you need, and you've got to be there to stay.
Right.
Now, the first thing you've got to establish, once you can get a toehold and get beachhead established and so forth, you've got to establish your more permanent ground-based air cover so you can continue the operation and release the carriers. So all those things, to Brad's point, if you talk about having to work seamlessly together and know what your priorities are and get them done in the right order. Saipan was the administrative hub for the Japanese in the Pacific. So you could almost say all roads ran through Saipan for many naval operations anyway. In fact, Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the combined fleet carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor and at Midway and Coral Sea and not fared all that well, was now in something of an administrative or paper command here on Saipan, along with the Army commander, which I'll just go ahead and mention. Never with the Japanese would you achieve unity of command at this stage. The Army and Navy would just resolve to get along, cooperate as they had overall. But so Saipan's getting close to, it's about 1,200 miles from Tokyo. It's the first large landmass to be taken in its entirety in the Pacific by the Americans. Okay. So It's going to take a lot of troops. And let me also say, this is the first time in history that 2 Marine divisions landed in the assault side by side.
Yeah.
Now,
And this is the point I wanted to draw out, Steve. This is a photo you sent me of the Amtrak coming ashore on Saipan. And this is now a very different, much improved amphibious warfare capability than we had even just a few months before. And they try something that you described that I had never read about called a amphibious blitzkrieg. Can you explain what that was and what they tried to do?
absolutely. With this new, we'll call it new, this new capability that the Amtrak or the LVT provided, what was new about it? Well, you could not only crawl over a coral reef and roll along through a lagoon or through the ocean, but once ashore, it could speed along on the ground as well. So it could provide some mobility and some firepower, not much in the world of defense, but in firepower it could. So they took a lesson from the Germans and the German Blitzkrieg, and instead of ship to shore, this was ship to 01 line, the first objective ashore, which was mile and a half inland. If you look at the map from Mount Tapocho there, and you can see the high ground, the shaded areas moving south through the island, that ridge was the first objective for the first ridge, I would say, would be the first objective for the guys. And it was planned if possible, for these Amtraks to launch from the LSTs and not stop at the beach, but to push all the way to the high ground of the ridge, hopefully to favorable ground where the troops would dismount and fight from there, and hopefully take away the commanding advantage that the enemy had.
And did that work?
It did not, for a lot of reasons. One, the 2nd Marine Division commander, General Watson, on the left, didn't really think that was going to work in his zone anyway. He got permission not to do it. So there's a problem. The 4th Marine Division believed it would work in their zone. Then on the left, we'll say the 4th Marine Division left. Once they got to shore, the leading wave of not those troop-carrying Amtraks, but the armored Amtraks, so-called armored Amtraks, had 37 millimeter weapons in them at that time. They're supposed to lead that charge straight past any beach defenses and go all the way to the 01 line up to that ridge at Finisusu. Instead, they stopped at the beach and started engaging defensive positions there. And the word went out that just ground everything to a halt. So the troop-carrying Amtraks couldn't proceed and then would not proceed. Now, the drivers were ordered by their commanders then to not try to go it alone. And their fallback was, if you can't make it, then we dismount and fight as boat teams. And that's what they did. So there's a lot of things at play there. And one of the things, Glenn, you're wanting to ask here, for example, the 2nd Battalion, 23rd, landing at Blue Beach 2 on Saipan, that leading wave of armored Amtraks, a different unit, that was an Army outfit.
Right.
Leading the way. Now, this, we don't get into the nonsense about, well, it's Army, versus Marine Corps, and they don't do it, as well, or any of that garbage. What that simply introduces is yet another barrier between understanding, a shared understanding that's so critical in something that's so audacious as this was, an amphibious blitzkrieg. If you're going to try something that audacious, you better know that it's going to take a lot of effort to achieve coordination and a shared understanding going into it about what the real objective is and how we're going to do things.
Right.
So no, it failed, and the guys had to dismount at the beach. And the story was that the Japanese were waiting for them then. They didn't expect them to land on that side of the island, but they were able to move their artillery and heavy mortars up to the high ground and pound the dickens out of them for a couple of days. So both of the Marine divisions suffered their heaviest casualties in the first 2 days of the Battle of Saipan.
And it was obviously a terrible battle. Now, just to jump back to one of the individual Marines involved here, this was another, I think, fascinating character in your book. His nickname was Pop Miller, an enlisted man, and I believe 38 years old. Is that right?
Born in 1908.
And
Yeah,
so,
as I recall. And
go ahead.
he was a tough individual, tough hombre. There was a number of fellows not unlike Pop Miller in the outfit back stateside, but most of them were left back stateside. And he managed to get overseas with the company. And the guys talked about, in fact, Jack Padley was trying to get him out of the outfit and back stateside as well before they went to Saipan, but he stowed away and arrived with everybody else on the ship. And everybody was glad that he was there. He was just a tough hombre. He looked out for everybody, but he liked to use a knife. And he would leave the lines at night, and all the fellows tell me that the word would go along the line that, be careful, Pop's out, and he would go hunting.
Unbelievable. And he is seriously wounded at Saipan.
He was during the mop-up phase. So he made it all the way through the operation to mop up, and a machine gun opened up, and apparently, and he was wounded pretty severely there. Did survive and did make it back home and raise a family, or get back to his family, which he had.
And how long were they on Saipan? How many weeks?
Well, they landed on the 15th of June, and the island was declared secure on the 9th of July. Now, during that period of time, they never had any change of underwear or change of utilities, most of them. And the only socks that they found, they were Japanese socks that they found. There were reasons for that, but Brad was alluding to, he referenced, you got to be careful about how you load ships and the prioritization of how you're going to unload them. Well, the changes of clothing were supposed to be brought along by the troops themselves in their sea bags. But the priority for unloading those things was so low that when the Japanese counterattacked, and we end up with the Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the ships all skedaddled. And took those sea bags with them. They didn't get unloaded in time to reach the Marines. So it was a miserable time between the 15th of June in this incredible heat and humidity and the 9th of July. Now, instead of stopping there at 9th of July, the fellows had to go for another week and mop up. And what that meant was clearing caves on the northwest side of Saipan, and clearing rocks and coral outcroppings, and trying to get civilians away from the Japanese military. And they were not always successful in doing that. And that was a terrible period for them.
And then, having gone through all of that, how soon are they moved to Tinian to take Tinian? How
Well,
quick?
they get 1 week's rest.
1 week's rest.
1 week's
After
rest.
suffering what level of casualties on Saipan?
Roughly, you're looking at 40% for Fox Company on Saipan of casualties. And most of your folks now have dengue fever, a touch of dysentery, and all other ailments, blisters and wounds that they're tending to and not reporting. And they didn't see themselves as very fit for combat, but that didn't matter. Things had to proceed. Fortunately, this was the first time, actually, every commander, even down to the company level, got in an airplane and flew over Tinian to have a look. And they knew the enemy was expecting them to land down south at Tinian town, and they were embedded down there pretty deeply. So the 4th Marine Division conducted what they refer to, they being history, as the perfect amphibious assault on these tiny 2 little beaches, 50 yards wide and 75 yards wide, like 1 and 2, where the Japanese didn't expect them. So we crammed a few regiments ashore very quickly on D-Day, which was the 24th of July, and before the Japanese could respond. And then the 2nd Marine Division came ashore the next day, or started to. And here you go again with 2 Marine divisions moving south to sweep up the Japanese.
Yeah. And how long did this operation last?
Not long. August 10th, they're leaving the island. And so the Japanese did counterattack the first night, and that's a pretty dramatic situation, as you know in the book.
Right.
But once that attack was broken, then it was pretty much a rushed mop-up phase until you get to the southern part of the island and the high ground down there. There was another fight in that area. So it was really all about that first night counterattack and then cleaning up at the bottom end.
Right.
In the rain.
it sounds like such an exhausting, whatever it was, 2 months or so for these Marines, and to suffer that level of casualties and still keep going is incredibly brave, incredibly courageous of them. Okay, so let me stop there because I think Todd, you might want to take a little station break.
Yeah, I just want to let people know you're watching the Veterans Breakfast Club, VBC Happy Hour, Greatest Generation Live. I'm Todd DiPastino. I am the executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we're a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh with an H at the end, Steve. And we've been around since 2008, and we hold events where veterans come and share their stories with the public. We always want non-veterans, people who haven't served, people like me, to hear the stories and be educated and inspired. And of course, we love to have veterans of all eras and ages and branches of service join us. We do it online every Monday night at 7 p.m. We will be here next Monday with Rosemary Schwobel will be on. I know she's on here, and Diane Schlosser also. They will be talking about, it's an open conversation for VBC Happy Hour, but I asked them to come on to talk about their father, who has a wonderful name, Ivan D. Thunder, who was a CB lieutenant on Iwo Jima. So we'll continue our Iwo Jima conversation. And he wrote a wonderful memoir of his time as a CB on Iwo Jima. And so we'll be talking with Rosemary and Diane. And also this man will be on to the right, Ray West. He was with the 28th Infantry Division in the Battle of the Bulge and captured and held as a POW from December 16th, 1944 to the end of the war. He is 102 years old, and he will share some of his story with us. So join us next week. That'll be February 27th at 7 p.m. We're also having our special event yet again for Vietnam Veterans Day, a very special day on our calendar, which is March 29th. This will be the 50th anniversary of what we might call Vietnam Veterans Day, the final, I guess, return of U.S. service members in 1973 after the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty. This will be an online event and in-person event, and you can register for it at Eventbrite. I'll put the link here in the chat. Every Vietnam veteran, everybody who served from 1955 to 1975 will get a welcome home bag from us, and you can find details on our website. We also publish a magazine, VBC Magazine. It comes out every quarter. We send it out free of charge to about 8,000 households, distribute about 7,000 more by hand. I know we have a lot of people on tonight who have never heard of the Veterans Breakfast Club, never been to one of our events. So I do encourage you, please do join us again. Get a copy of this magazine. It's thin, but it's very high quality. We take the stories that we hear on our at our events, and we write them up as magazine articles and send them out and publish them. Finally, we have a survey that we hold every Monday night, and it's open all week. We're just asking people, what do you think of this program? How would you rate it? What did you like or not like about it? And how can we improve? It takes about 2.5 minutes to fill out. You go to SurveyMonkey. I will put the link here in the chat. Thank you, Glenn, for giving me that chance to make a few public service announcements there.
Okay, great, Todd. Thank you. Well, listen, let me give the audience fair warning here. Todd, I hope you're okay with this. I know we're not going to be done at 8:30. To do justice to this story, I think we need another 10 minutes or so beyond the 8:30 stop.
Got it.
Because we're just getting to the good part. Really the climactic part, I should say, right? In Steve's book and in the story of this rifle company. Okay. And that obviously that what we're going to get into now is the oops, let me get my fumbling done here. Is the Battle of Iwo Jima, which was 78 years ago. Is that about right?
78.
As of yesterday.
That exactly right. Exactly right. Now, the reason they're going to Iwo Jima, just very quickly, again, the 4th Marine Division really fought its entire war for the B-29 bomber. That's why Saipan and Tinian were important in the first place, and boy, did they ever become hubs for the B-29 operations. And right in the middle of that travel path between Saipan and Tokyo was this little scab of an island in the middle of the Pacific, and it was problematic. There are a lot of discussions that have gone over, was it worth it and all that kind of stuff. But you'll see in the book, I took the angle of let's see what the airmen had to say in terms of General LeMay, Curtis LeMay, and his conclusion, his point was that it sped the operation of the war greatly once this battle, the threat from Iwo Jima was removed. So here again, you've got two Marine divisions landing in the assault, the 5th Marine Division on the left and the 4th Marine Division on the right, beginning with Yellow Beach 1 and 2 and Blue Beach 1. Blue 2 was not used because the high ground to the right was held by the Japanese over the East Boat Basin. So the 25th Marines would land in a column there on Blue 1. The first objective was the number 1 airfield, Motoyama number 1, which was in terms of Yellow Beach 2, is 735 yards inland and uphill. So the elevation from sea level at the airfield is 200 feet. So this is a slog uphill through, as Brad mentioned, what he called gravel, and I refer to it very much as grit because it's 60% glass. It's not sand at Iwo Jima, it's volcanic glass. Also, I'd like to point out, it had a high content of magnetite, which would affect the operation of mine detectors. It's a very strange place, but when you tried to step or walk in this stuff, especially after it had been loosened up for 72 days of bombardment, then you would immediately sink down past your ankles, halfway up to your knees at least. You've been on a ship for over a month. So you're probably, you've lost some fitness and you're dehydrated. We know how tough it is to remain dehydrated anyway in normal circumstances. Then in combat, that's multiplied many times. So moving forward and making that push all the way aside from the enemy fire, if you can just get up to that airfield, just physically is going to be a tough task on D-Day.
One of the things I wanted to get into here, let me remind myself where we were going with this discussion, because we didn't want to go deeply into the landing again in the interest of time. But one of the aspects that's in Steve's book that is so fascinating is the role played by the medical teams, the corpsmen at the squad and company level, the doctors at the regimental level, etc. And there's a particular corpsman, Doc Bankin, who we're going to talk about in a minute, that is particularly compelling. So this picture here, Steve, remind me, this is after Iwo Jima, and these are all corpsmen, correct?
These are all Navy corpsmen. The Marine Corps today, just as it did then, receives its medical support from Navy personnel. And each battalion, infantry battalion or battalion landing team, has a team assigned to it under the leadership of the battalion surgeon. And in the case of 2nd Battalion 23rd, that was Glenn Rice, who was the tallest fellow on that photograph standing in the back. And I think his son Steve is somewhere online with us as well. So I don't know if we can, if we get any questions or comments from Steve through chat, then we'll certainly address those. Glenn was outstanding, did a terrific job, and his corpsman thought very highly of him. That photograph, oh, there he is, there's Glenn. Born in 1916, as I recall. Is that right? I think that's right. Steve can correct me on there.
Is Steve online? Is Steve with us? Do we know, Todd?
I think I know he was. Let me see here. Let me oh, yep, here he is. Steve. Hello, Steve.
Do I have that right? I think born in 1916.
We'll ask you to unmute, Steve. There you go.
Yes, 1916.
Terrific. And passed away 1 month shy of his 100th birthday.
Yeah, he made it to 99 and 11 months.
Wow.
Wow. Wow. How old is he in this picture, do you think, Steve?
Well, he finished medical school at the University of Oregon in Portland in 42. and he had a year, and so he would have been 20 in 45. He was 29 years old. But this picture, I think, was when he first went in the Marines in 43. So he would have been 27.
Handsome young man. And for a doctor, help me understand. I know the corpsmen were Navy corpsmen. Were the docs Navy docs?
Yes, he was. He was commissioned in the Navy and thought he was going to end up on a ship's with a ship's pharmacy, and he didn't know that the Marine Corps got all their docs from the Navy. So they assigned him to FMF Pacific, Camp Pendleton. He didn't even know what it was.
Fleet Marine Force, right?
Fleet Marine Force. Yep.
All right. And he was the battalion
He was the
medical
battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion.
officer?
And I think he had about, Steve, correct me, but maybe 25 or 30 corpsmen underneath him. And he delegated them to the different companies. And then he had a sick bay group that stayed with him.
That's right. And generally, and you're looking at Iwo Jima headed there, is roughly 35 with those corpsmen.
35.
Now, you would, it is also helpful for folks to realize what Steve just differentiated there. He would use his chief to assign corpsmen to the line companies, the rifle companies as needed, and platoons. And generally speaking, to begin with, that might be as many as 4 corpsmen with a rifle company. As you know from the story of Saipan and certainly on Iwo Jima, you sometimes get down to the point where there was 1 Navy corpsman with the company.
Right.
Right. Dr. was that. And but he also, Dr. Rice, kept his aid station men. Now, they weren't trained the same way as the line corpsmen. The line corpsmen spent much time with those rifle companies, with the platoons, and training in the field with them. So the Marines taught them how to maneuver, snoop and droop like Marines do. And he, in turn, that corpsman, would teach the Marines how to take care of each other and do some quick first aid. And that was their primary function. Those line corpsmen weren't there to do surgery. They were there.
Were there other medical doctors at the battalion level, or was he the only medical doctor?
There was 2. There was a battalion surgeon and an assistant battalion surgeon, and then a chief pharmacist mate from the Navy, or a Navy enlisted man. And then I think everybody else was at the corpsman level. So 2 docs for what is it, Steve? 1,500 people or something like that.
Well, nearly 1,000 when they land. That's your close.
Okay. Yeah.
So, now,
and he was in the 6th wave on Iwo Jima, so he was always every one of those landings. He was in maybe the 3rd or 4th wave. Anyway, he hit the beach right behind the rifle companies.
Absolutely.
And he was in all of these island campaigns. Do I have that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
he was.
Yeah. Wow. And I know we'll get to it a little bit later, although we got to move a little quicker. It's not like he was 5 miles behind the lines in some nice hospital building. He was right up there close and ran into a few Japanese himself, especially on Iwo Jima, as I recall.
Yeah.
He did. To summarize it, probably too short. The corpsman would do absolutely anything insane to stop bleeding and get the guy who was wounded back to the battalion aid station, where the battalion surgeon would do only what was necessary to get him back, if needed be, get him back to the regimental level or division level. So he didn't want to do surgery in the battalion aid station. You're out in the middle of the field in the grit and dirt and all that. Now, sometimes there might be something like an amputation, or you had to close something up, but you didn't close them up too tightly at the battalion level.
Yeah. So, Steve, forgive me, but I'm going to move a little quicker here. I'm going to not skip, but I'm just going to barely mention one of the more compelling stories or interesting stories you tell, and it involves this nurse. Remind me of her name.
Her name is Ensign Jane Kendi. Her nickname became Kendi, and from Ohio. And here she is photographed by a Navy photographer, Gil DeWitt. tending to one of Fox Company sergeants, Bill Wyckoff, who'd been wounded there in the northern part of Iwo Jima on the 6th of March. A very famous photograph, reproduced in newspapers and magazines all over the place. In fact, I think of the National Geographic of September 45 had this photograph and story in it. And on the other end, they were reunited at an Iwo Jima reunion in the mid-1980s out in San Diego. And it was a surprise to her when they marched Bill out there on the stage. And it was a pretty exciting time, and also covered in the newspapers at that time.
And she made several plane trips between Guam, was it, and Iwo Jima with wounded Marines. Is that right?
That's right. She was in the first flight that was coming from Guam to Iwo Jima once the first airfield was somewhat secured. And the second airfield also, but that was the 6th of March, and she was supposed to be in the second plane. I won't tell the story, but she ended up the first Navy nurse to land in a hot combat zone, and it was there on Iwo Jima, and that's part of the reason she was made such a celebrity and brought back to the war bond effort. And she was also then the first onto Okinawa after that as well. Ended up marrying one of her pilots, for that matter, and her last name became Cheverton.
And Brad, if I know my Marines very well, they're all thinking right now, man, I hope this is the nurse that takes care of me.
Well, yeah, I just have to say the bond between the Navy corpsmen and docs and the Marine Corps is very strong. We take care of each other, we respect each other, and there's a bond there that's it's very tight and respectful. My hat's off to all of them.
We want to get into this last part of it's chapter 32 in Steve's book, and I just think it's the most riveting chapter in the book. And it's the story that takes place here where that explosion is on March 8th and 9th. And the two men that we want to feature are this man, Sam Haddad, and then a Navy corpsman by the name of Doc Bankin. And that's the last story I'd like to tell here in the interest of time. And I'm sorry, Steve, that my apologies for not giving us as much time as I would like to have. But tell us about Sam Haddad.
His Marines referred to him as the gentle giant, roughly 6'3" or 4", and nobody really knew, but a tall fellow with a voice that was below the floor. Deep bass, very calm voice. And he came in, he joined Fox Company as a brand new private and came out with a field commission on Iwo Jima as a second lieutenant. And to your point, that section in northern Iwo Jima is when he really came to the fore for the entire company. He was one of the towers of leadership in Fox Company throughout as he came up through the ranks, became a sergeant, and then on Saipan, and then made a platoon sergeant, serving as a platoon guide, as it were, in the second platoon at Iwo Jima. And when third platoon, and then when second platoon lost its lieutenant, he was brought over to second platoon to take command of that and was made a lieutenant. But the story about northern Iwo Jima is about the rocky terrain. We see an aerial photograph here of the last position that Fox Company occupied when in frontline combat. To get there, they had to fight through. If you look at, you can see Lieutenant Collins's name, but the terrain behind that elevated rocky terrain. This is where the company had to fight, and Haddad was adamant when in his discussions with me that he would put it this way: on Saipan and Tinian, you could control a unit, you could control a squad. They had flat spaces and you could see where everybody was. On Iwo Jima, it was not a matter of control. It was a matter of everybody knew where they had to go. Why? Because you couldn't control a unit or a squad. You couldn't see them, 3 or 4 men to your left or right. Now, the higher echelons could not reach these fellows in that terrain with supporting fire. The battalion's 81 millimeters, Buck Finney said they did all they could, but he thought their fire was largely ineffectual. So it was down to the rifle squads and really the small teams, thankfully, that had been formed almost a year before in 1944 and all that time training and combat experience that they had. It was down to them to generate the action and generate the resolve that would lead to action. So this was all about personal leadership, and this is where Sam Haddad excelled greatly, and that became his legacy within the company.
Right. So what transpired on the 8th and 9th of March, and what role did this man right in the middle, Doc Bankin, play in that 24-hour period?
Well, it's now, Brad, you had a question earlier. It surprised you that General Snowden had not sought a medal for Doc Bankin. Now, we'll pick that discussion up. I will summarize. I won't tell the entire story here. But I had picked up the reins to try to get a Medal of Honor awarded to Bankin just a few years ago. And that effort continues, let's put it that way. But the point is, we were not doing it for a single action, but instead for an entire day, what he did especially through the 8th of March, when the company was finally together and the tank infantry team was finally together for the first time in this entire operation. And they start pushing down that corridor that you would see in that aerial photograph, Glenn. And as they do, and they continue to suffer casualties, they end up in minefields and so forth. And Doc Bankin is seen running out into the minefield to heave a Marine over his shoulder and carry him back to Dr. Rice at the aid station, which by my measures are well over 400, 500 yards away, and takes yet another round through the leg doing this. He's already been wounded once on Iwo Jima. By my count, if I recall, he's wounded 6 times on Iwo Jima alone. He'd been slashed by a saber on Saipan and wounded by a mortar round that landed almost in his lap on Tinian. And he kept showing up. His words were, well, no bones broken. So he'd bandage himself up and head back up to the Marines. And they couldn't believe he was coming back, but that he just saw that as his duty. And with all his efforts, he was awarded a Purple Heart, or several Purple Hearts for Iwo Jima. General Snowden, Brad, you had a question. It's a shame General Snowden didn't pick that mantle up, try to get the Medal of Honor for him or some kind of medal. He didn't know about it. He did not know about it. And when he read the very first rough draft of this book, he was aghast, both by Haddad and by Bankin. He just had no idea. And that was the case here. And by the way, that's also indicative. That's why there are no photographs down that corridor or in that rocky terrain. You're not going to get combat photographers in there. The officers were wiped out to a large part. They're just not there. And it requires, as you know, an officer to witness an action, for example, to get the Medal of Honor underway. So you're down to the NCOs, and nobody saw what was going on. It was one heck of a feat to try to put all of this together for the first time and make it make sense.
And it wasn't Doc Bankin left for dead at one point?
Well, yes. So the night of 8-9 March, the Japanese finally come out of their underground positions and launch what we call a counterattack. And it hit the 2nd Battalion primarily. And in the middle of that night, some rounds were flying. Mortar rounds were landing in the company headquarters, and Doc was trying to tend to someone who had a grievous wound in the leg. And he himself was wounded. And as he was being carried back to the aid station, they were ambushed by some Japanese. And there were 3 stretchers. He's on one of them. And of course, the Marines had to drop the stretchers and scatter, and they were wounded. And the Japanese bayoneted and smashed the skull of one of the other Marines on the stretcher and tried the same thing with Bankin, but he managed to somehow survive that as well. And in fact, when Eddie Davis, the company runner, was trying to get to him with some help, and Doc had already seen that happen to these other Marines on the stretchers and warned him away. So the Japanese are too close by, stay away, of all things. So that's when Eddie went after the mortar men to come back and help and run them off.
Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. The first visit that I had with the Marines in 1996, the first name they mentioned to me was not a Marine. It was Doc Bacon. And that's what he meant to them. In fact, one of the Marines said maybe 8-10 years ago, when I mentioned his name, replied, probably the most important guy in the company.
Wow. Wow. And just to have been awarded a Purple Heart is almost unfathomable. And when you read the book, and I hope everybody in this audience goes out and gets this book and reads it, you'll understand. It's just a riveting thing. So we have to find a way to conclude this at some point, right, Todd? We can't go on another hour.
Yeah, we could have, I would love Henry Shepke. Henry, if you're still on, please unmute yourself. Henry is one of our high school students who joins us often on Monday nights. He goes to school in Madison, Wisconsin. Steve, he knows your book, and he certainly has been in contact with many, many World War II veterans. Henry, do you have any autographs from members of Fox Company?
Yeah, I was wondering if Steve has heard of someone named Robert F. Glenn.
Robert F. Glenn.
I think he was a member of Fox Company. I got his autograph here. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, terrific. The name does not ring a bell at the moment.
And I also, I thought I'd show this. I got an autograph from an Iwo Jima veteran, not from Fox Company, but he just suffered a stroke, but he signed the photo here for me. I thought it was really nice.
That's terrific. What's his name?
Tony Kappa.
Oh, well, now he's a 2nd Battalion guy.
Yeah.
In fact, he was in G Company. Now, I did not know he had suffered a stroke. I saw him in 2020 out in San Diego, and had an opportunity to spend some time with him there and a little bit thereafter. Steve, you might remember Tony as well, Steve Rice. He was there in the audience. I'm sorry to hear that. How's he doing? How severe was that stroke?
I think he's doing good. Yeah. Yeah, he wrote me a nice letter.
That's terrific. Yeah. There you go. Small world, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd.
Todd, were there any questions in the chat room or other?
Yeah, I'd love to, Steve, I'd like to introduce you to Ira Martin, who does very similar work to what you do, except with the Korean War veterans. Ira, I bet you could relate to a lot of what Steve has been saying about the relationships you build with these veterans.
The whole presentation's kind of been uncanny, merely for the fact that it sounds like this book is the project I've been working on, like you said, for our Korean War veterans. My specialty is 11th Marines and 52 and 53, with a dash of 5th Marines and 7th Marines and 1st Marines. I'm very curious. I'm always humbled when these veterans share things with me, many of which have never shared anything even with their families. And as a researcher, some of that stuff tends to affect you. I'm curious if you'd be willing to comment on that. Sometimes when you're touching on information, some of it may even be off the record, how that affects you as a researcher. And then I'm kind of also curious, well, I just go ahead and work on the first part, I guess, if I could. It's go ahead. I was also going to say I'm constantly losing veterans, which I'm sure you went through a phase of and have experienced too, and how that affects your research and or you as a person.
Well, thanks for your comments in that question. It starts to feel pretty lonely as the years go by. Now, having been, and Glenn alluded to this when we first started, it's an interesting angle. I refused. I didn't think a book could really be done on these guys for many, many years. It was just, there were too many minefields. The reports are too sketchy and broken and incomplete. It was very expensive, right? Years ago, to go back and forth to the National Archives and use the photocopier and make long distance phone calls and all of that. Technology has shifted a bit. Also, some new findings with research had emerged, and eventually decided I think we probably can take this on and let's see what we end up with. And that was after our final reunion in 2013. But I had been with these guys for a very long time, and with informal relationships. I mean, we were best friends. Gunny Douglas is one of my best friends that I've ever had. Don Swindle in the book, probably one of my closest buddies, aside from someone with whom I grew up, and I traveled overseas with him as well. Every time, or Danny B. Thomas, the corpsman, when you lose these fellows, you're not just losing a veteran that you have a contact with. So lost a lot of friends and family members, and you hate the feeling of, well, okay, you're it now. And so it's very important to extend that family and be close with family members like Steve Rice, and many of the others. My own approach to those folks was passive. I had a researcher or a correspondent ask me one time how I got them to talk. Well, I didn't. I went to the places and hung out with them until they did talk and made myself available when they were talking. At reunions, they didn't go to talk about the war, and they certainly didn't go to be interviewed by some young guy. So I would show up and have that recorder handy and notepad handy, and they would sit and talk, and the guys who didn't would leave the room. As soon as the conversation starts, off they would go. So this, the information, the comments that are used in the book are the ones that, in my mind, and with my judgment, based on knowing these folks and knowing the team, and that's 2F23, it's what they would tell. And there's nothing in that book they wouldn't tell, or the things they would not tell are not in the book. If the door opened during a conversation and the conversation stopped, it's not in the book. This is their book, not mine. And it's important for us to realize this is a study of a team, and it's an embodiment of a team between two hardcovers. So yes, there are some things that I left out. I did choose to name some people and not name others because of stuff we see. You know, Hollywood likes to try to find the weirdo and go after them. I see, by the way, as we're having this conversation, I see Greg Ash joining. He's the son of Len Ash, and those who've read the book, he was one of the movers and shakers in Fox Company there.
And Greg put an interesting comment in the chat. Greg, do you want to ask the question?
Well, hey, Steve, just
Hey,
gents, thanks for this. And Steve, just want to thank you again on behalf of all the families, the work you've done, the way you brought things personally home, and just the expansion of perspective that has been not only gleaned by us, but just made available to everybody is so deeply heartfelt, appreciated. So what a blessing. What an awesome contribution. And I'm loving the book. I'm weeding through it, and I've taken a break and done some other things with some traveling, but looking forward to finishing. But Steve, I just keep, thinking about your journey. I've asked you how you started it, how you found Fox Company. But the thing that kind of goes through my mind is the why. And it more is from a perspective of now after the fact. As you look back on your journey through this, how do you feel about just the contribution of Fox Company, your story, your participation in it? How do you feel that affects not only World War II veterans, but maybe veterans abroad, and maybe just people here looking to glean from history? How do you feel like this book, in your experience, how do you feel from a heart perspective, the why pertains to maybe where we are today? What's the significance in your mind?
If I understand the question correctly, Greg, I'm not the sharpest light bulb in the drawer.
Yeah. It's a loaded question, bro. So I think about, just from your journey, looking back on it, you're now speaking to the new troops at Pendleton graduating on lessons from Iwo Jima, and you've gained so much from it. How do you feel like, why Fox Company? What do you feel like in thinking about it, why did that company surface, and why do you think it has significance in this book? I think about things like, Lieutenant General Snowden and the founding of the Reunion of Honor, and what a window that provided of history. But I wanted to hear from you. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah, that's a
Well-
loaded question. I understand that's a big one.
Well, it is, and I'll try to edit on the fly here. Fox companies, you know, in hindsight, I'm very thankful that it was Fox Company that I ended up with, because these guys treated me. I was the classic boot showing up, brand new recruit, looking for what I was looking for. I was looking for the big heroic stories and all those kinds of things that you're going to look for when you're 30-something years old, whatever I was. And, you know, all that kind of heroics. And this was Jack Padley's company that I ran into. And you're not going to get that. This was a very highly disciplined company. They were underspoken, understated. They didn't do anything dumb or stupid. In fact, they went out of their way to eliminate stupid. I say in the book, probably more than one time. I know I say it several times. One of the big differences, maybe the primary difference between combat veterans and the green troops just showing up, is the veterans have learned what not to do. It's like a good chef. A good chef knows when to not season the food and when to stop cooking. A good musician knows what not to play. Okay. That's the maturity that this company had. So they took their time, including your dad, Greg, took their time, and Sam Haddad especially, in grueling me up slowly, very patiently, to imbue, I hope, in me some of their personality and their experience, some of that maturity as a rifle company. And that's why it was so important to fight for the subtitle, The Experience of a Marine Rifle Company in the Central Pacific. Now we see, and we have the right to look at all these things that impact the human experience out there. That is the value to Marines today and of the future. In fact, anyone serving, any families of service personnel. To me, perhaps in my mind, the most important chapter in that book is when they're leaving the Black Dragon, when they're leaving Iwo Jima and we're on the ship. These guys start riding home and they're talking to their families. We see it right there. Everything is right there as you leave the island. Very important. So, yes, and the other element of this, which I think you were also touching on there, Greg, is this thing was, since after all these years spent with these guys, this thing was, what was the motivation? Done out of love. Absolutely love these guys, love the family members, love Fox Company, and wanted to tell people about it. And maybe that was necessary to take on such a lengthy project as this.
Thanks, bro. Appreciate that. Good stuff.
Very good stuff. That's very, very eloquent of you, Steve. That's a great summation. Todd, where do you want to go?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This was a long program, but a wonderful one. And man, can I relate to the work that Steve has done and Ira has done, that sense of the sense of how honored I feel, not being a veteran, being invited just to listen and being, you know, the patience veterans have shown me as I ask my questions, as I grow from maybe being a boot to I don't know, something beyond that, not much, but something beyond that a little bit. And you know, and once again, it's the human dimension, the human experience of service, which is what we are all about at the Veterans Breakfast Club. I hope that all of you who haven't joined us before will join us again sometime. Let me know if you'd like to get our magazine or join us again. Todd, TODD, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. You can see our schedule at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ira, and all the family members and others who joined us tonight. Take care. Enjoy the rest of George Washington's birthday. Observed. All right. Take care.
Steve, thank you again.
Thank you, Glenn. Thanks, everyone.